Welcome, Gunrunner.
Okay, so we all know about the Sony PlayStation, right? If you're watching a video about any kind of gaming subject, then I guess that's a given. But did you know that the PlayStation wasn't Sony's first games console? I'm the Laird, and I bring you this fascinating story. To start this one off, we have to go right back to 1983 and examine Sony's origins in the game industry, one that most interestingly involved an alliance with now bitter rivals Microsoft. While the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64 were entertaining audiences in Europe, and the Apple II and Atari 8-bit were lighting up the American television sets, a group of people over in Japan were figuring out a way to get themselves a slice of the booming home computer market. This group was led by one Kazuhiko Nishi, who was then vice president at Microsoft Japan, as well as being a director at ASCII Corporation. One thing he quickly realised was that there was far too many home computers on the market and it was getting saturated. He deduced that the industry needed a common standard that could be adopted by all manufacturers. Remember, this was a good few years before the IBM PC compatibles that we all use today took over and did just that. Very forward thinking indeed. Development of this concept had started as early as 1980, and it consisted of a Z80 CPU, a Texas Instruments TMS 9918 video chip, and a General Instruments AY3 8910 sound chip, which is more commonly known as the PSG, or Programmable Sound Generator. It would also feature 64K of RAM, built-in Microsoft Basic as standard, and MSX-DOS. Although primarily designed as a computer, it also included a prominently displayed cartridge slot, which had been put there with video games very much in mind. Once the concept was complete, Nishi started courting all the big Japanese electronics companies to produce their own versions of the machine. One of the very first to jump on board was Sony, who had introduced their hit-bit range in 1983, starting with the base model hit-bit 10 and going into a multitude of other revisions, including the hit-bit 101 with its built-in joystick for gaming, and the hit-bit 75 with its built-in business applications for more serious users. The hit-bit range would prove extremely successful for Sony, not just in Japan but also in Europe, where they were one of the few manufacturers to support the MSX standard. MSX2 based versions of the hit-bit range would follow in 1985, with the last model, the IBM PC-like hit-bit F500, being released in 1986. Although not strictly games consoles, many of Sony's hit-bit machines were definitely built with gaming in mind. These weren't Sony's own foray into the home computer market though, as between 1982 and 1985 they also released the SMC series of machines, a range of high-end computers that were mainly aimed at business users and particularly the video production and editing market.
キーをヒットすると答えがビッと出るヒットビットのヒットビット新しいセイコのパソコン
It's a Sony.
Now one thing we all know is that Sony and Philips were the co-creators of the compact disc format itself, probably one of the most important inventions of the 80s. But what you might not be aware of is that in 1984 both companies had already started working on an evolution of this. This new type of CD would combine audio, text and graphics to become the very first attempt at true multimedia. The two companies joined forces to develop a draft standard at the beginning of 1985, and later that year Matsuista joined in to work on the development of the integrated circuits. The first public announcement of this new product, that would henceforth be known as the Compact Disc Interactive, came in March 1986 at the first industry conference to promote the CD-ROM format in the United States. A provisional standard, called the Green Book, was issued 2 months later in May. A fully functional specification of the system was issued a year later, with the first CDI discs and prototypes being demonstrated to potential licensees 3 months after that. In autumn 1988, the very first CDI players would be thrust into the hands of developers and previewed to the press. However, we would have to wait until December 1991, over 5 years after the CDI project was first announced, to get our hands on a retail unit, and this is where it really gets interesting. Because while we all associate Dutch electronics giants Philips with the CDI, they were far from the only company producing them. Again, this draws large similarities to the aforementioned MSX standard, another technological development that was backed by both Philips and Sony and designed as an industry standard. Among the many companies that would produce their own CDI players were household names such as Philips, Magnavox, Goldstar, Bang & Olufsen, Memorex, Grundig, and of course Sony. In fact, Sony produced 3 different models of the CDI that were very different to their rivals. This is because they were both portable, and to differentiate their own players, Sony called them intelligent discmen. The IVO V10 and IVO V11 both had built-in LCD screens, while the IVO V12 did not. The V11 was merely an upgrade of the V10 that had some improved features, while the V12 was created mainly for professionals to carry around with them to demonstrate CDI-based products in different locations. This of course could be connected to any standard TV. It's unknown how long Sony produced these models for, but the CDI standard failed to take off the way the company hoped, especially in their homeland, with most of the success coming from Western Europe. This makes these intelligent discman models very sought after, and they can fetch pretty high prices on eBay.
Say you're watching TV and this guy says...
It's CDI, friends, the next generation CD player that works with your TV.
And you'd say...
But I have a CD player.
Then your mom says...
No, dear. CDI works with your television.
You'd probably feel pretty dumb and maybe even fake it like you'd already experienced the ultimate in games, movies, music, and more.
Trust me, babe, I know about this CDI stuff.
Now get into CDI, starting at $2.99 with $200 of free software.
Around the same time as the release of the Sony CDI, the electronics giant also decided to dabble in the world of video game publishing for the first time too, and in 1989 they created the Sony ImageSoft label. This division was initially created to publish games for Nintendo consoles, but it wasn't until they started producing games for Sega systems that they experienced any real success. On May the 20th, 1992, Sega of America and Sony Electronic Publishing announced a partnership to create content for Sega's consoles under the direction of the ImageSoft label. Besides Sega's cartridge-based Mega Drive, Master System and Game Gear, the partnership would heavily target the upcoming Mega CD add-on too, thus seeing Sony return to the format they helped create. Such was their focus on this peripheral that one of their titles in Sewer Shark would actually be bundled with the North American version of it, named the Sega CD. Other big-name titles that Sony ImageSoft released for the Mega CD included Hook, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Sensible Soccer, ESPN Football, and Chuck Rock. This label would eventually be merged into Sony Computer Entertainment of America with the release of the PlayStation in 1994.
Talk to your aunts.
So,
I hear your grades stink.
you don't look healthy. Eat a roll. Eat a roll. Eat a roll.
Eat this, you gravy-sucking dog!
Cliffhanger from Sony ImageSoft. Sure, it's just a game.
Now, I know what you were thinking. I've left something out, right? Yeah, okay, you got me. It would be pretty remiss of me not to mention the legend that is the original Sony PlayStation, aka the SNES CD. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail on this one for several reasons. Firstly, because I think most people know what it is, and also because it's worthy of a separate video on its own. Now, what you do need to know is that the relationship between Sony and Nintendo started when Sony engineer Ken Kutaragi developed the sound chip for the SNES. After seeing their rival Sega announce the Mega CD, Nintendo knew that they had to respond and thought who better to work with than the co-creators of the CD format themselves, who had already done such a good job on their previous project together. Development of this format started officially in 1988 among much speculation in the press. Under their new agreement, Sony would develop and retain control over the Super Disc format, with Nintendo effectively handing over control of software licensing to Sony, something that they weren't particularly keen on. So to counter this, Nintendo tried to also negotiate a more favourable contract with Sony's long-term European partners Philips, behind Nintendo's back. Of course, this sly manoeuvre angered Sony greatly, and they soon decided to go off on their own, and I think we all know how that turned out. Nintendo didn't stay with Philips for too long either, as after seeing the failure of the Mega CD in the marketplace, they promptly cancelled the SNES CD and the agreement with Philips, which most famously led to a series of rather infamous Zelda titles being released for the CDI format. Isn't it interesting how every single Sony product I've mentioned in this video also involves Philips in some capacity? The breakdown in relationship between Nintendo and Sony is often quoted as being one of the biggest mistakes in video game history, and had this not happened we might have never seen the PlayStation brand at all, which has gone on to dominate the industry since the first console arrived back in 1994. So there we have it. There is much more to Sony's video game past than just the PlayStation, and I hope you enjoyed this interesting story. If you would like to help support my creative work further, then please make sure you check out my Patreon, where you can make a pledge and get access to lots of exclusive content. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon. Bye bye!